Hello everyone. Today we're going to have our final mini lecture. This one I think will be a little bit longer than the others, but it's one way to sort of wrap up the history of photography by pretty much seeing what's going on today. Since this is basically a 6-week course, really 5 weeks because you're spending the last week writing your final papers. Um, uh, you know, I'm covering a lot of these subjects with a broad brush and not very deeply, but I hope that these lectures would help supplement your readings, which I encourage all of you to read, and they're required, in fact. Uh, a big part of what we call photography today is what some people would call almost like the post-photographic condition or era. And this comes about with this, notion we've already talked about even ever since the 19th century about the proliferation of images. But I mean, what's different now, obviously, is that things from commercial photography, as we've seen when we talked about advertising, to even the news or what we see on our screens, is that everything is basically image-centric rather than text-centric or audio-centric. There's the primacy of the image, not just an illustration even, but of the photographic image. Another part that's been different is the what we talked about, the mass circulation of images that started in the middle of the 19th century with the carte de visites to the existence of millions of readers of these photo magazines in the middle of the 20th century, and now, of course, to the mass circulation, use and reuse of images via the internet. It's this digital era that makes the production of images very simple, or more convenient at least, and the distribution to be just as convenient. In other words, you don't have to have a publisher to publish your images. You can just put it up on Instagram, Facebook, and so on, who sort of act like as real-time publishers of images. A big part of the post-photographic era is the notion of the changing of reality. The conversation in the 19th century was often about how photographs mirror what's in the outside world, but what we consume now is what most of us would experience to be the real world. In other words, there's no disconnect between the real world and the digital world because everything is sort of experienced through the digital world. So the notions of virtual realities and augmented realities, while new, in many ways, because of the technological developments over the last few decades, it has set up image viewing to open up to these new realities. You've also read earlier about the pictures generation in the mid 70s. The term came to the Met in 2009 as a sort of a term, but the idea is these artists who came out of a media culture. Now, the media culture in the 70s obviously weren't computer images, but they included movies, television, and magazines with a proliferation of images. So a lot of the artists that some we've talked about, like Cindy Sherman, Barbara Kruger, and so on, are artists who basically grew up with images. And if you can imagine artists now who are a continuation of this pictures generation, but not in an analog sense, but in a digital sense, the types of works that come out, a lot of them are based on already existing images. You would always hear the whole thing about, why create new photographs when there are so many in existence? And there's a lot of truth to this, and that's why a lot of artists appropriate images. As we'll see later on, and as I've said in prior lectures, this is, of course, not completely new. Perhaps the most early controversial artists who use appropriated images would be Richard Prince. Here's is probably his most famous image called Untitled Cowboy, 1989. It's about 50 by 75 inches. If you're familiar with advertising prior to this time, you'll notice that this image was actually not copied from, it was directly copied from an ad for a cigarette called Marlboro. And the photographer of this image was actually Sam Abel, who was a National Geographic photographer since the 1970s and who also did commercial work. If you compare this to Richard Prince's work, there is not a Richard Prince literally took the image, cropped out the logo, and perhaps moved the horse and cowboy a little bit further to the right, meaning cropped it out more to the right, to create an image that basically is quote unquote his. You can imagine that something like this would be controversial, but he created more controversies recently with a series of new pieces called New Portraits. This was in 2014. Basically, he took people's Instagram feeds and their own people's own photographs, and he would blow these up. He would actually have his own. He would comment on these Instagram images, and then right after he has whatever comment he puts in, he would copy these and then blow them up and then sell them. Of course, the people who took these photographs and the owners of the Instagram feeds sued him in court for copyright infringement. But this is a big part of what, at least the most extreme part. Oh, actually, it's not the most extreme part. I'll show you something a little bit later. But the idea here is that what we receive as images in a lot of ways are already new images themselves, or could be owned by others. There's a recent let me go back to this slide because I just said that it be owned by others. It's actually the question is whether this is Richard Prince's work or not. In a lot of ways, he took these images by reframing them in some ways. It could be looked at as a type of photography, another type of capture, except he's captured these on his screen as a consumer and then put these up as his own. Lorna Bieber is an artist who was shown at the art gallery here at Stony Brook last year, and she does a type of appropriation herself. She used to work for magazine publishers, and there would be a lot of images that would be left on the floor, and she cobbled a lot of these images together to create prints and to create larger pieces, constructions basically made from images that were taken by others and then printed in magazine form. Her whole exhibition at the gallery was much of it is based on this notion of basically found prints or found pages in magazines in order to create new ones. If you've heard my lecture earlier today, of course, this reminds one of Hannah Hoch's work, who did the same thing with photo collages, which are being done now. So this isn't completely new. Hannah Hoch obviously is somebody from the early 20th century. One could also say that appropriation, that the master of appropriation would be Andy Warhol himself, who took images from television, images of celebrities, images from newspapers and so on, and reproduced those not through the computer or through digitization the way Richard Prince would do it, but using a silkscreen method. This is his Howdy Doody piece from the Myth series in 1981. And this is James Cagney and The Kiss with Bela Lugosi in both around the early 60s, 1962, 63. So you might say that in some ways, you know, in probably the in a literal sense, Andy Warhol predated Richard Prince's work. This perhaps will be controversial even to us now because there's no attempt even to hide the fact that an image has been quote unquote copied or reproduced. In Andy Warhol's sense, you can tell it's reproduced because he uses silkscreen method. In Richard Prince's case, you can tell it's reproduced because it's obviously blown up. His piece, the cowboy piece, Untitled Cowboy piece, is I think about 50 inches by 75 inches. So it's much larger than the ad itself. But Sherry Levine, who basically took photographs of Walker Evans's work, and this one piece is called After Walker Evans 4, 1981. It's a gelatin silver print, and it's about 5 inches by 3 inches. So you can imagine this is actually a photograph of Walker Evans's piece in the book. And in this case, there's no attempt to make you think that it is another photograph, and you almost wonder whether this is actually Walker Evans's work himself. This one's After Walker Evans 1, done by Sherry Levine in 1981. And this is about 3 3/8 by 5 1/16. So these are like photo-sized images. Here's another one by Sherry Levine, or is it Walker Evans? This one is called After Walker Evans 11, and this is about 4 by 5 inches. Again, the size of a snapshot photograph. These could be photographs that were shot from Evans's book in praise of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Another type of, I guess I would suppose, post-photographic imaging would be what I would consider to be cinematic photography. Basically influences from movies and film. And we talked briefly about Cindy Sherman's work, where the idea is she would take these self-portraits of images that seem cinematic, so it registers within us something, some sort of uncanny response to an image that we may have seen at the movie somewhere. Some old film from the middle of the 20th century. This is probably her most famous one, Untitled Film Still Number 21, done in 1977. I'm not going to pause too much in this, but the idea is to create images that give us the uncanny sense that we've seen it before. Seen it before as part of a culture of cinema, moving images, and so on. Gregory Crewdson was somebody else that we've discussed as well. Somebody who creates these very complex stage, they're not even stage sets. You would photograph many of these things in situ, actually in public, and they look like stills from movies, and nothing's really been highly photoshopped or anything. All the lighting is done on site. They're beautiful images, and the only word we can use is basically cinematic. Something like this can come from a science fiction film. Now this one was, done in a stage set, but the whole idea is that what they evoke in us is the notion that this would be something that we may have seen before in a film, and it replicates the same type of feeling. And in some ways, it's strange because you see these as stills, and we recognize them but don't recognize them, and so on. Just two quick ones would be James Casaberry. This is Yellow Hallway number 2, 2001. Normally in a class, I would ask, what they see here, etc., etc. But the whole point of this is that these are actually scale models of architectural photographs. So he would create really small models, these would be, and then put water in and so on. But the idea almost feels like Crewdson's work with these ones where the water feels like this one. Except in Crewdson's case, he creates images that are full size using real people. And in Casaberry's case, he creates images using scale models. This one is called Garage. And this is a scale model of basically a suburban development. Going down from a small scale, there's to the opposite side. I want to talk briefly about what's called limit telephotography, and I'll read this from Trevor Paglen's website. Limit telephotography employs high-powered telescopes whose focal lengths range between 1,300 to 7,000 millimeters. At this level of magnification, hidden aspects of the landscape become apparent. It most closely resembles astrophotography, a technique that astronomers use to photograph objects that might be trillions of miles from Earth. In some ways, however, it is easier to photograph the depth of the solar system than it is to photograph the recesses of the military-industrial complex. Between Earth and Jupiter, which are 500 million miles away, for example, there are about 5 miles of thick, breathable atmosphere. In contrast, there are upwards of 40 miles of thick atmosphere between an observer and the sites depicted in this series. The sites are actually military sites that nobody's allowed to go to. So Trevor Paglen would bring basically high-powered lenses and photograph these sites. And he, in some ways, he reaches sort of the limit of what can be photographed because they become very eerie surveillance images. His point is basically he's someone who's surveying those who normally would survey. But since these sites are not accessible by the public, he would obviously have to photograph from very far away with a lot of thick atmosphere in between. So the images, you almost have to believe that this one is called Detachment 3 Air Force Flight Test Center, Groom Lake, Nevada. Distance 26 miles, done in 2008. So you can't even see the details. I mean, obviously the point is that you're not supposed to see the details from far away. Here's one called Chemical and Biological Weapons Proving Ground, approximately 42 miles, shot at 10:51 a.m. in 2006. So you can sort of see some sort of desert and some dots in there, but it becomes completely abstracted. Okay, the most obvious thing when people talk about photography today is basically the manipulation, the digital manipulation of images. Everyone always talk about whether something is photoshopped or not, right? Even people who don't use Photoshop know what it is. Perhaps the most iconic, or somebody who was famous in using digital manipulation in the late 90s is Andreas Gursky. Here's his piece, 99 Cents. This is a very large piece. I believe I talked about this earlier on. It's about 6 feet by 10 feet. So you can imagine standing next to this piece and seeing sort of this being hit with a barrage of colors, tacky colors and products and so on. But this isn't really, this is a 99-cent store, but he duplicated, or he had his team duplicate a number of the images. He created the reflection up on top there to basically create a sense of being overwhelmed by consumer products. This is his work called Paris Montparnasse, done in 1993. Again, this is huge as well. It's 6 feet by 14 feet, so you can imagine this in a huge wall, highly detailed photograph. This is based on a building actually in Paris, but again, it's been digitally manipulated to create sort of this affective response from the audience. of being overwhelmed by too much stuff. This is his Chicago Board of Trade, a 2 in 1999, 5 feet by 9 feet, again digitally manipulated to make you feel as if you were there. So a lot of these things, even the cinematic work of Crewdson and so on, the whole point isn't really the veracity of an image or you know, the truthfulness of a photograph at a particular point in time, or a particular point of view, but it was literally done to draw out some sort of emotion from those who are viewing it. So here's a quote from Gursky. He says, "Since 1992, I have consciously made use of the possibilities offered by electronic picture processing, so as to emphasize the formal elements that will enhance the picture, or for example, to apply a picture concept that in real terms of perspective would be impossible to realize." The final digital enhancement artist I'd like to talk about would be Lauren Marsollier. This is from her Dislocation series. So looking at this almost looks like something from the New Topographics, which I didn't really talk about, but it's worth looking into. And I would recommend that if you want to do your work on architectural or landscape photography, that you do your research on that for your final paper. These are basically manipulated, but in a more subtle way than Gursky, to create more empty landscapes without people, but again using a combination of images. Here's another one for images. And this is from a combination of 2 or more images photoshopped together to create a scene that could actually be real. Here's another one with a golf course on the right. Once you get something like this, you can imagine it being true, but perhaps not. You know, these white chairs next to some sort of metal structure. And here's the final one. Okay, I will quickly go over, for those of you who do not know, of course, the whole the technological foundation for most of what we've talked about so far is just the whole notion of digital photography. We've talked a lot about film, but we never really talked about the mechanics of digital photography. But just to be just to go over this very lightly, I guess. Here's a chart that you have the lens, which exists in any camera obscura. It also exists in a digital camera. You have the subject, the object being photographed. The light enters the lens, but instead of hitting film, light-sensitive film, the light actually hits light-sensitive a light-sensitive sensor with a filter that pulls in either red, green, or blue colors. It's almost similar to color film, right? Except instead of chemicals being affected, these sensors, light-sensitive sensors, convert light not into. They don't convert the chemical. Change the chemical properties of something that's on a substrate, but it actually converts these colors and digitizes them. A lot of the developments in digital photography now isn't so much on the how many pixels that the resolution of an image, although that's part of it. Anything beyond 65 megapixels is already pretty clear, but on how the RGB sensors are arranged. So with color film, there's usually 3 separate layers of film, but a normal digital sensor has a single layer of pixels. And there's another kind of sensor that sort of mimics color film that has three separate color layers stacked on top of each other. Again, I'm going through this very quickly mainly because of time, but you can do this research online yourself in terms of sensor technologies. The standard sensor is a Bayer sensor, which has a grid of the RGB set together in line, and the Fuji X-Trans sensors seem more random, so it prevents what's called moiraying in photography, which is a problem with the higher resolution. The higher the resolution, the higher the possibility that it could moire. The sizes of the sensor are all different. You know what? Everyone wants to talk about having a full frame camera, right? Which is about 24 by 36 millimeters. And an iPhone is super small, and the standard now is a full frame, what's called full frame. But in some ways, this is very deceiving because if you go to film, a full frame camera is actually very small. It's on the lower left part. So a full frame camera is the same as a 35 millimeter camera, which is actually a pocket camera that was created at the early part of the 20th century, which photojournalists use. But once you go to 4x5, which is a medium format, it's not even an 8x10 camera, a 4x5 camera. If it were a sensor, it would be so much bigger. There is a reason why, even up to today, it's not just this desire to do things in a retro manner, that people want large format cameras. This is Ansel Adams on top of his car shooting at Yosemite. With this looks like a little bit larger than an 8x10. But you can imagine that people have been using even larger sheets of film. Whether they're better photographers or not is another issue. But the point is that how far we've come today with digital technology is not necessarily that quote unquote advanced, given the size, what's possible in terms of the size of the sensors. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the types of less obvious uses of digital processes. We've seen people quote unquote photoshopping images by creating composites, or in the case of Gursky, duplicating windows in a building to make it look bigger, etc. I think in a lot of ways people have played around with quirks of digital photography. Jonathan Lewis, in his series, Walmart series, basically went the opposite way, with this of pixelating images and making them even look rougher. So he's almost like a Minecraft photographer, right? This is a Carrefour, which is a grocery store in Europe. And he took an image of the Carrefour. You can imagine Gursky's 99-cent image, which is a high resolution image that's about 6 feet by 10 feet. And that was done in 1999. And you have photographers today almost sort of embracing lower resolution images. Here's his Lidl 2016, which is another European store. And Aldi 2006, which I think there's one in the States, in the US. And here's a Marks and Spencer. And he, follow along this sort of trajectory. He photographed display cases, sort of removed in some ways, turning brands into generic brands through pixelation. This one's called Chanel 2009. This one's called Gucci 2009. and Sonia Reichel, 2009. Another type of photography that sort of came out of grungy and glitchy images, most notably from Star Wars, where every transmission, you would have this um, civilization where they have all these technologies, but whenever they project an image, it always has to be kind of rough and glitchy. So that type of style or that look has been, carried through into what's called glitch art. So a lot of the images and the would be manipulated in a way to um, show its sort of backside, or there's almost this attempt or this joy in trying to find some flaws in an image. These are actually animated, and they're not animated at this moment, but you can imagine, the waves in the background sort of changing and so on. Here's one from called by Sabato Visconti called Apocalypse Beach. Taking something as banal as somebody's beach photograph and making it apocalyptic in some ways, and with this repetition of images and the pixelation that happens with this. Here's another from the Apocalypse Beach series. Again, same thing. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about in terms of the sort of a new use of images other than, duplicating windows or candy bars and so on beyond glitch art would be, again, the use of images that exist, right? If you use Google Street View, you can imagine something like this having some sort of potential to an artist, because these are existing images of streets. So if you want to be a street photographer, why go out to the street when you can just go on Google Street View and do screen caps of the images taken automatically by Google's trucks. If some of you are not familiar with Google Street View, basically it's a car or somebody with a backpack or a small little scooter, and it has a camera that's about 14 feet up in the air. It has about 8 or 9 cameras that shoots that Google sends out pretty much all over the place, as many places as they could find, to take these images. Now, one of the first artists who played around with this, or at least an artist who became famous for working with Street View, is John Raffman, who would sort of travel around in Google and look for images, like just really strange images that would probably fall into surrealistic images, right? Like Man Ray-esque, although I don't think Man Ray would do this, but the notion is, or Dali-esque images. And here you don't know what's going on. A woman's pulling another woman's hair. In this case, a glitch causes this man walking down next to a river of some sort and turn him into two people, twins. And it's interesting because you could say that Google Street View itself can replace traditional sunset and travel photography. Why go somewhere to take a photograph of the sunset when you can just go to Google Street View? Or even National Geographic photographers. This one's taken by Google Street View as well. A lot of the emptied parking lots of the Utopographics images can be taken from Google Street View as well. And this is, again, another one of John Raffman's work. It's a strange photograph of a cow limping its way across a road. And another one, you don't know, again, images don't say anything in the end. But you can imagine people projecting, are these people stealing the television? Is that somebody on the lookout? You can imagine these images of basically nothing um, taken automatically, literally by a machine, creating images that can be where stories can be made out of them. Here's a strange one with people with masks, one with some sort of wolf outfit. Here's a tiger coming out, middle of a parking lot. And somebody hiding in the bushes with some sort of gas mask. A lot of this notion of wandering around, you can say, came out because of Guy Debord, who was part of the Situationists, had this idea of the dérive, which is like an unplanned walking through a landscape where you're drawn through by anything. It's basically wandering around randomly in a lot of ways. And for them, it was a way to fight the boredom and the predictability of a society of images. It's a type of 20th century flaneur. And you can say that, John Raftsman's Flannery in through Google Street View is sort of the same thing. To conclude this very long mini lecture, and I appreciate you sitting through a lot of my ums and pauses and so on. When we started this course, a lot of the things we talked about was this obsession about sort of this pencil of nature, that this attempt to find a machine that can capture what can be seen by the human eye in the 19th century, to simplify it, has been changed in recent years because of this, our sort of being immersed in a society of images, and being immersed by and through images, and looking at the world through images, that this model of the camera obscura in some ways has kind of mirrored itself, that a lot of times what we are seeing in photography today isn't necessarily the real world, but sort of like this self-enclosed viewing of another representation. They're almost representations of representations that go on ad infinitum. The history of photography is is complex. There's a lot of the discourse around it. It often depends on the age and the time that photography runs through, but it's certainly a very interesting jumping off point to talk about things, especially now that we live again in a world of images. We live in a world where anything and everything that we see is always through an image. To the point where we don't know where, what is real or not real, or even we would question whether, does it matter whether what we look through is real, or what we look at is real or not real. It makes us question the notion of not just reality itself, but in the case of photography, what that means to even think about how to see things photographically, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and so on. Thank you for sitting through this lecture. I hope that you have read all the materials and are ready to write your final papers. I encourage you to put something up in the discussion board for your final project so other students could help you. And please, if you do know anything about something that somebody puts up, please comment and help your fellow students out. Thank you so much for again sitting through these lectures, and if you see me on campus, just say hello. Goodbye.